Colleagues, let us gradually begin our meeting today. It's my great pleasure to call the one-day conference on Russia invasion of Ukraine, its assessment, implications and prospects open. And it's my great pleasure to introduce and to welcome here one of those persons without whom this conference wouldn't be possible. So when several months ago Dr. Zahra Babar from Georgetown addressed to me and asked to help them to plan and design the conference on the impact of the war on the system of international relations. We could not imagine that it will be turned into such a big event, and it was largely due to another person who is sitting in this room, to Dr. Maryam Al-Kuwari, who supported our event and who was very kind to launch the cooperation between the Center of International Regional Studies at Georgetown and between the Gulf Studies Center that I'm proud to be part of, and hosted it here, acknowledging the importance of this event, and was participating actively in forming the agenda of today's event. Dr. Maryam, from my personal point of view, represents the best example of young, ambitious leader who will definitely be moving forward the Gulf studies here and who represents his bright future. She is a graduate of the University of Exeter, where she received her PhD. She has a deep knowledge of social, economic issues of the Gulf and specifically Qatar. And it's my pleasure to call her to this podium to introduce the guests and to open our meeting. Dr. Maryam, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Dr. Nikolai. Ladies and gentlemen, assalamu alaikum and good morning. On behalf of Gulf Studies Center at Qatar University and the Center of International Regional Studies at Georgetown in Qatar, I welcome you all, our guests, speakers, and participants to the second day of this event titled Russia's Invasion of Ukraine, Assessment, Applications, and Prospects. To be honest, it's such an honor and a privilege to have this big and diverse, knowledgeable group at Qatar University, and thanks to Dr. Zahra for this great opportunity. And I look forward to the fruitful discussions, and before we start, let me just say a few words regarding this matter. Russia's invasion of Ukraine has had profound impact on international system and global economic relations. For the first time since the end of the Cold War and the dissolution of USSR in 1991, Europe's security has been directly jeopardized, and sovereign European state has been militarily punished for what is claimed to be independence, choice, and right, refused model of development and behavior imposed from a foreign nation. The depth of the impact of war in Ukraine on the world economy is no less deep than on the system of international relations. First, the conflict has further worsened the severe weaknesses and disruption in the global economy and supply chain that were triggered by the COVID-19 pandemic. Secondly, the conflict has resulted in imposing sanctions limiting the access of Russia as a major producer and supplier of oil and gas to world markets, not to mention the severe impact on Ukraine as a major exporter of raw materials. This has eventually led to the dangerous weaponization of a global economic and financial mechanism, as well as the hydrocarbon industry and trade, as both Russia and its opponent have entered into a war of sanctions against each other, undermining a free market and global trade. Thirdly, this war is not only creating additional risk to the global economy and trade, but it is also undermining the stability and peace in Europe and potentially other regions. Especially, both sides continue to dig their heels in a way that may expand the scope of the conflict. And yet, after almost 3 years of conflict, there has been no consensus among the international players and political forces with regard to Russia's action in Ukraine. A wide range of opinion on these issues continue to exist in this world. From the blind rejection of Russia as a subject of international relations to terrifying justification of Russia action by some political forces in the Middle East, Latin America, and Asia. These differences in assessment are clear between the forces of the global North and global South. This dichotomy is not just a clash between the two positions, but it also creates new points of tension in the relation between the countries of the global South and the global North. Most importantly, the conflict has effectively undermined the function of the Security Council and the ability to address the conflict, especially that permanent members of the Security Council are directly and indirectly involved in such conflict against each other. Under these circumstances, it appears both timely and crucial to convene a two-day event that would actually include leading international and regional expertise in economic and international relations, to discuss the situation around the war in Ukraine, which would help us to improve our own understanding on the ongoing process and develop recommendation for politicians. So just let me give you a summary of the participation format and the outcomes. So today's event will address the critical dimension of Russia invasion of Ukraine, focusing on the consequences and exploring regional responses from the Middle East and the Arab Gulf countries. So the format of this conference is, as you can see, is a public event. Consists of 3 panels following with the closing session. Each panel will have 4 to 5 speakers. Each speakers will have, I would say, 10 to 15 minutes, and then follow up with the Q&A session. So then we have the closing session. The main goal of this closing session will be to sum up the discussion of the day. Okay, for now, it's my pleasure to be the chair of the first panel, titled Consequences of the War, Impact on the Key International Players Involved. And please join me to welcome our speakers. First, I would like to welcome, and please excuse my pronunciation for the names, Orysia Lutsevych. She's the Deputy Director of the Russia and Eurasia Program and the head of the Ukrainian Forum at Chatham House. Her research focuses on social change and the role of civil society in democratic transition in Eastern Europe. She's the author of the several Chatham House research publications, including Giving Civil Society a Stake in Ukraine, Recovery in 2023, and Resilient Ukraine, Safeguarding Society from Russia Aggression in 2022. Please. The second speaker, Stefan Meister, is the head of the Center for Order and Government in Eastern Europe, Russia, and Central Asia. Previously, he served as a director of Heinrich Paul Foundation, as well as he has extensive experience in Russia domestic and foreign policy, EU-Russia relations and post-Soviet conflict area. Stefan has authored several works on security dynamics in the Black Sea region, EU, Eastern Europe neighborhood policy, and Russia disinformation. Stefan, please welcome to the stage. The third speaker, Olga Oliker, the Program Director of Europe and Central Asia and International Crisis Group in London, where she oversees research and advocacy relation to Russia, Europe, and Turkey. Her research focuses on military, political, and social development in Russia and Ukraine. Previously, she led the Russian and Eurasia program in Center for Strategic and International Studies and directed RANDs. So please, Olga, please. Last but not least, Paul Musgrave is an associate professor of government at Georgetown University in Qatar. His research focuses on the U.S. foreign policy, international relations theory, and the impact of a global energy market on politics. Professor Musgrave's work has been widely published in a top academic journal. And he previously taught in University of Massachusetts, and he holds PhD in government from Georgetown University. Professor Paul. Finally, Andrei Yakovlev is an associate at Harvard's Davis Center, and he's an economist. His research focuses on state business relations in Russia, development economics, and also industrial policy. He was the director of Institute for International and Market Study at HCE University in Moscow. Andrei, please have a seat in the program. So now, excuse my weird and awkward transition to the chairs. Okay. So we will start our first panel. My first question to you, Orysia. So it's almost like more than 3 years since the war started in Ukraine. And my question to you, what are the Ukrainian and Russian perspective on the causes of Russia war in Ukraine? And if there is a lessons behind this war, what are the lessons have been different parties learned from this war, Orysia?
It's a real pleasure and delight to be here, and thank you for taking time on the weekend to come, and thank you for caring about what is happening in Europe. A lot of people, I'm Ukrainian myself, my family is, part of my family is in Ukraine, and I remember when the war started, a lot of people were asking me, how are you? How everything's going? And it was a very common answer to say, my family is okay and my family is 42 million. And when the first missiles dropped, it was a real connection among the people, no matter where you lived, in Mariupol or in Lviv, in Kharkiv or in Odessa. Everybody understood the existential threat that has arrived for the second time on Ukrainian soil since the annexation of Crimea in 2014. So now it's soon 1,000 days and soon 3 years, and soon 11 years that this war is lasting in Europe. And it's a total war. This is one of the scary lessons, the way Russia wages this war against Ukraine. It's not a selective area of military campaign just somewhere in a contained territory. Russia is actually viciously attacking Ukrainian civilian infrastructure, from hospitals to schools to now more seriously energy generation. And as the winter is coming, and you can imagine what a modern city can look like without an electricity. It's about water pumps, it's about sewage, it's about heating, and Ukrainian winters can be very cold. So people feel vulnerable. The front line is very long. It's more than 600 miles and now stretches all the way from parts of Russia in Kursk that Ukraine has occupied all the way to the south in Crimea. This morning, you know, many Ukrainians, the way they live, for you to understand, they check the news. The first thing that happens, and every night since this soon 1,000 days, there's a drone attack, a ballistic missile attack, and every day, like this morning when I woke up, I read that in Dnipro, which is a city in the east, 14 people were injured, 4 of whom were children. In Kyiv, 6 people were injured, 1 were children, and this is the daily reality of how Ukraine is. So of course there is exhaustion, as you can imagine. Emotional exhaustion, psychological, physical exhaustion, but there's still a very high spirit of resistance. And you would wonder where this comes from, right? Because perhaps you wonder Ukrainians would want to stop it at any cost. But I think this resistance comes, the energy that allows Ukrainians to stay in the fight comes from the fact that this is a real genocidal war, that the Russians decided that Ukraine must not exist. So the only choice that Ukraine has is to fight. And there's a saying in Ukraine that if Ukraine stops to fight, if Russia stops to fight, there will be no war. If Ukraine stops to fight, there will be no Ukraine. So you can understand there's no more people, no people on earth that want more peace than Ukrainians, but on the other hand, they have to understand how they can protect their statehood. And I mean, what is happening, because this is a total war, Ukrainians are doing everything they can, from teachers to IT, to chefs and cooks, to soldiers, to participate in this resistance. And you'd be surprised how many companies, if their people are drafted to fight, they're actually like serving them back home to buy what they need, from mobile showers to chocolates, in addition to what Ukrainian Ministry of Defense is providing to them. And they are rebuilding already, which is quite striking, because they are building new shelters in schools so that children can go to school under these attacks. They are buying generators for winter in order to, open restaurants and bookshops, and at home have a place to warm their cattle. And the railways are running on time, actually better than in the UK. You can arrive, you can travel between Kiev and Odessa, Kiev and Kharkiv easily. Of course, there are many people who are displaced, especially in the East, and a lot of them are abroad in Europe, and families are separated because Ukrainian men cannot leave unless you have a medical condition or 3 children. Most Ukrainian men cannot exit Ukraine, so women and children are abroad and they're separated. So just briefly 3 lessons, because I know I must end. What are we learning, especially people in Ukraine? I think the first lesson is in self-reliance, I would say. And I know we hear here in the region a lot how it is important to rely on yourself. And I think what Ukraine is doing right now, instead of thinking of how capitulate or how to exchange territory for peace, it is increasing defense industrial production, actually twice in this year. It has now the capacity to build around 4 million drones a year, for which, already 1.5 million are in contracts. So it is participating, and I would say leading, the 4th generation of military revolution. And these drones are destroying very pricey targets, including, Russian radar systems, headquarters of the fleet, Russian Black Sea Fleet, and they are leading this innovation with a lot of volunteer support, actually. A lot of these military startups are not driven by the states, they're driven by the private sector. So I think that is an important future for Ukraine in winning this war, in also having a new type of economy after this war. What is also striking is the lesson, many learned how brutal and naked force is Russia. How the kind of regime that has developed in Russia is hugely demodernizing. It wants to drag Europe, drag the world into the type of politics that existed probably in the 19th century, because it cannot compete in nanotechnologies, cannot compete in green transition. It can basically compete in violence. And by spreading this chaos, it has a competitive advantage. And it's not only spreading this chaos and violence in Ukraine, but if you look widely in the region, across Russian borders, from Georgia to Moldova to Central Asia, there are places where Russia is interested in fermenting this disorder. And I think I've heard from a senior European official who told me to my eyes, I thought that if Russians lose 500,000 men, they will stop. And I told him, Russians are not counting losses in men, they're counting losses in tanks and machinery and airplanes. And as long as they are able to have this equipment, they will be fighting. That is a lesson to remember, the way Russia fights its wars. So I want to thank especially Qatar, because we are here in Doha, for returning Ukrainian children, because that is part of this genocidal war I'm talking about. Putin wants to make Ukrainians into Russians, and he wants to re-educate Ukrainian children in Russia to make them hate Ukraine and to make them hate the West, to make them hate the other, and to weaponize actually Ukrainians against the future war with other enemies. So, and the last lesson is that for whoever shares your security threats is your security partner. And we see it in Ukraine, those countries closer to Ukraine that commit quite a lot of its GDP to defense of Ukraine are Denmark, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Finland. Not in absolute terms, but as a percentage of their economy, they are here to make sure Ukraine succeeds. And I think personally, given the nature of this war, and given the fact that this is a war about the past and the future, like I said, I think the future will win. It will come at a high price, but I think we are at the critical juncture still. It's not a decided outcome, but I think there's enough will. There will be a coalition of brave and willing to actually set things straight, not just for Ukraine, but for the sake of international order. I'll stop here. Thank you very much.
Okay, all right, okay. So, Stefan, Orysia described the violence and the chaos situation in Ukraine. And from there, I wanted to ask you, what are the key outcomes and the consequences of this conflict after 3 years of violence? And what these outcomes and consequences mean for Europe in general? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yeah, it's working, the microphone? Okay, excellent. Thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation. It's really a great pleasure to be here. We had great conference day yesterday, and I really appreciate also have this public event, an auditorium to discuss and exchange also. I think it's very important because I think we tend to be very much in a European bubble, very Eurocentric discussion, and I think this war has global consequences, and it has also consequences for the relations of the European Union, of Germany, with countries in the Arab world, but also in other countries in the world. So I think it's really crucial to have this outreach and to have this exchange and have this mutual understanding. And I think for me this is a very valuable. This is very valuable also with this event. Nevertheless, I have to present, or I will present a little bit a European and also German perspective. So it will start maybe a bit also Eurocentric, but it's also I think important to understand. I think we first of all have to understand this big Russian war since 2022 in Ukraine is the end of the collective post-Cold War European security order. So this is what has been agreed after 1991 when the Soviet Union collapsed. This is now collapsing, this regime in Europe. And there will be a new European security order, and we are in a transition to this new European security order in an environment which is anyway changes. I think globally we see the end of US unilateralism. We see a much more fragmented world, and I think also their multilateral institutions are in a decline, and I think that has a very strong impact on Europe, but also on Europe's positioning globally. And I think this war is an accelerator for all these transition processes in Europe, but also in the world. And I think from a European perspective, I have to say this is the biggest challenge of European security since World War II. This is the biggest war in Europe, I say this also as a German, since World War II. And for Russia, this war is about its own role in future European security order and also its global positioning. So I think Russia very much defines itself against the US, against NATO. I think this is the main focus also of how Russian elites think about, and I think they have this competition in Europe with the US, but I think this is also about, in my opinion, about Russia's global positioning. I think what we have learned, I have to say this, I think there is in Europe no security outside of NATO anymore. Therefore, NATO has become, again, the key security actor in Europe, and we have seen a NATO in northern enlargement with Finland and Sweden. So I think while NATO was withdrawing in a way from Europe, now it's back. While the US was in a way withdrawing from Europe, it's in a way back, and NATO is even enlarging. I think we have to say also that NATO membership for Ukraine is the only guarantee for long-term security. But I think there is no consensus that it will come since this war is still going on and Ukraine cannot control its territories. So I think this is a dilemma also for Ukraine. There will be no security outside of NATO or serious security partnership. But at the moment, there's no willingness of key NATO members to bring Ukraine into NATO. I would even argue Russia has reinvented the West, the so-called West, with this war. I think the West was in a way in a decline. There was much more fragmentation also among Western actors. The US, as I said, was already withdrawn from Europe, and this has now in a way reversed. But I don't think this trend will end. I think it's maybe just an intermediate period where Europe needs the US and NATO more, but I think we see also this fragmentation globally is going on and also inside of Europe. So I think we'll have to see what the West really means in the future. Yeah. So I think what we have seen, and this is for Europe quite a big thing, Europe went on large-scale sanctions against Russia. It's very costly also for us, especially for Germany. We cut off from Russian gas, cut off most of the relations with Russia. We started also to support Ukraine militarily and financially. And we also the EU started to enlarge itself again, which is really a game changer for Europe. So I think there were several taboos which were broken after this war, and there were really some substantial decisions from the EU member states and also from the European countries with regard to Russia, but also with regard to Ukraine. And I think that comes with quite a lot of costs. At the same time, I think we have to be self-critical also. There is a lack of European and especially German leadership on the war. The key actor is the US. The US is leading. And I think we're doing mainly crisis management. There's a lack of a long-term strategy also with regard to Russia in Europe. And I think Russia will not disappear. Yeah. So I think we have to deal also somehow with it. And I think we have to define here a long-term strategy also in dealing with Russia. And I think that's not happening at the moment. We have also to say, and I think this is maybe also a lesson learned, we see the limits of the West. The West could not force non-Western countries to follow its sanctions policy. And even by itself, it's not really consequent on the sanctions. So I think we should be also here critical about ourselves while we're criticizing others. But I think what we see is also the limit of Western powers in different regions of the world to enforce its policy. German and US leadership, I talk about German Chancellor Scholz and US President Biden, they agree on not provoking Russia too much, which means to support Ukraine that it is not losing the war, but not support it in a way that it is winning the war. And I think this is somehow problematic because it's, on one hand, we have the very strong rhetoric about Ukraine has to win this war, we're supporting Ukraine. On the other hand, I don't see really the size, the scale of mid and long-term support for Ukraine that it's really capable and able to win the war. And I think for us, it's crucial that Russia is not winning the war. It's, as I said, it's about European security order. It's about being also giving not Russia the opportunity to divide Europe in spheres of influence. And that's why it's so crucial, not only for Ukraine, but it's also crucial for other European countries. I have to say, after nearly 3 years, Russia has adapted to the war. It has become a mean of stabilizing the regime in Moscow, this war. So it's a kind of a legitimization resource, but it's also stabilizing the Putin system in Russia itself. So maybe Russia even has an interest to keep the war, or Russian elites even have this interest. European societies are tired from the war. It wants to end it. But I think there is no momentum to end the war. You have to do something also to create conditions to end this war, but I think we are not doing it. Ukraine needs to negotiate from a position of strength to get a sustainable result. And there we are back to the question how far we are supporting Ukraine to get in a bargaining position, really to negotiate an agreement. And I think this plan of victory of President Zelensky is exactly about this. How to bring Ukraine in a position of strength, and here the West is crucial. I think we also learned that Russia has weaknesses. I think its army is much weaker than we expected. I think there was also this assessment in the first days of the war. It will take maybe 1 or 2 weeks, and Russia will win this war. Now Russia is fighting about villages in eastern Ukraine. So I think we also see the limits of Russian capabilities, of military capabilities. And I think that's a very important lesson also for NATO, for our defense or our military, also to learn from the war, how Ukraine is waging this war, reacting to this aggression, and how Russia is also adapting. I think we have to understand that Russia has a very different cost-benefit calculation than European countries have. I think Orysia already mentioned this. If there are 10,000 people or 50,000 people die from the Russian side, they don't care. This is not possible in Europe. So we care about every single person, and I think the same in Ukraine, and that makes it very difficult also. To discuss and calculate, because it has a very different logic. And we have to understand also Ukraine has a high quality of adaptation, but it has much less resources. So, and I think there is this asymmetry, which where we play a crucial role. Just to understand, I'm coming soon to an end. Just to understand, I think Europe is not really united on the war. I think while those countries who border on Russia understand this as an existential threat, this war, those who are more far away do not share this perception. So we have a disunited Europe also, how far we can go and how united we are on supporting Ukraine. As I said, I think NATO is the key security institution or actor in Europe now, but the EU is not a security actor. And I think everything is now about security. Everything is securitized, not only in Europe. It's a global issue. But if you don't have in your DNA this element of security policy, this element of being assertive, being decisive on the security issue, you are weak. So, and I think that's why Europe is seen also as a weak actor from many external players. And I think on this war, Europe needs to learn to become also a security actor and also beyond its neighborhood. And I think for Germany, my own home country, as the natural leader in a way of Europe, we have to redefine our role also in Europe. Our role in Europe and in the world. Our Russia policy has failed. It's a bankruptcy of German Russia policy, this war, which was always about appeasement, always about giving Russia a little bit to get also something. And this does not work with powers like Russia. And what we see as a result of this is that Putin keeps the escalation dominance. We are very reactive in this war. We do crisis management, as I said, and we have to change this logic of the war. I think this is crucial. And I think this refusal of reality, this lack of strategy, gives Russia an advantage in this war, despite its weaknesses. But I don't believe that Russia can win the war. Russia is a declining power. It's a declining empire. It's a colonial power, also in its neighborhood, and it is increasingly dependent on China, on Chinese technology. It has to make compromises with China, but also with its post-Soviet neighbors. It's losing its hegemony in regions like the Central Asia, like the South Caucasus now, with this war. So we see the limits also of Russia, and technologically and economically, it cannot compete on the global stage. So we see a declining power, which will be more disruptive, which will be more aggressive because of its weakness. But this decline can go long. We know how empires fall. I think this is a long-term process, and this is a process we have to manage. And for this, we need also partners here in this region, but also in other regions of the world, how to manage such a declining power like Russia. I end here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Stefan. So you raised a very good point that the key player in this war is the United States, whereas the European countries, the role is very limited. So therefore, I really wanted to focus on the United States' role in this war. And my question to you, Olga, how has the war in Ukraine affected U.S. foreign policy? And to what extent this war is central to the U.S. foreign policy at the moment?
I think we want it to be green. Now you can hear me, it's green. Okay, fantastic, thank you. Okay, good morning. So in order to answer this question of the role of the war in Ukraine in US foreign policy, I think it's helpful to think back a little bit about how the role of Ukraine in US foreign policy has evolved since Ukrainian independence, which, we're now looking at 3 decades of that, right? But when Ukraine first became independent, what the United States was most interested in was making sure that there was no nuclear weapons and no nuclear weapons infrastructure left in Ukraine. And that was the focus of US policy. That was the negotiation between Kiev and Washington. That was, and for a while, Ukraine was the 3rd largest recipient of US aid behind Egypt and Israel, which took turns in the 1st and 2nd place, because of denuclearization assistance. Now, the way that assistance was spent, and I think this is really important to remember, is mostly went to US contractors who then spent the money in Ukraine. So Ukraine didn't get all of that money, right? American firms got most of that money. That's how most US aid actually gets delivered. It gets delivered through US contractors who keep a lot of the money. The Ukrainians wanted a closer relationship. The Ukrainians wanted security commitments. The United States had absolutely no interest in any kinds of commitments to Ukraine. This was not because nobody thought Ukraine was in any danger. Honestly, if they thought Ukraine was in no danger, they would have been happy to offer security commitments. That's how NATO has worked for a number of years now. So when you look at things like the Budapest Memorandum and the very careful wording in English that it's security assurances, not guarantees, that is a product of a very clear effort not to give Ukraine security guarantees, not because you don't think it's necessary or could never be necessary, but because you don't want to be on the hook when something goes wrong. And of course, the something going wrong is a threat from Russia. If you look at the documents from the 90s, if you happen to have lived the forging of the documents of the 90s, you will know that the threat from Russia was always there. So I just kind of want to start with that. In the early 2000s, the US got involved in a whole bunch of wars, and the Ukrainians had the Orange Revolution. The Orange Revolution was very exciting for the Americans. It was more exciting for the Ukrainians, but for the Americans, it was a sign that Ukraine really did want to be like us. That did not make the Americans want to give Ukraine commitments of any sort. It just made them kind of happy for a while. And then frustration set in when Ukraine did not live up to that initial promise, when business as usual returned to Ukraine's very democratic and therefore very fragmented political scene. But the Ukrainians had already hit upon this idea that what they would do to try to get the Americans on their side is support America's wars, send forces. The Ukrainians weren't the only ones trying to do this. What they and the other countries trying to do this discovered is that if you send forces, the Americans will say thank you. They will not give you security guarantees or commitments of any sort. The American view of partnership is very consistently that what we're doing makes sense. It is in our allies and partners and friends' interests to go along with us, and in fact, everybody else's too. So of course they would. We don't owe them anything for that. So once again, the Ukrainians continue to be in a space where the United States was not interested in giving them any sorts of commitments. In 2014, Russia invades Ukraine and annexes Crimea. and the Americans try to manage the situation. They want to limit their engagement and their involvement, and they largely do, right? It's the Europeans who are involved in the Normandy format of trying to get out of this. The Trump administration throws some wrenches into the works, but really in all directions at once. When I go to Kiev now, I do often hear, well, we got javelins under the Trump administration. They did. I mean, I also remember how that administration's officials came back to Washington and briefed on this, which is that the javelins are going to be kept as far from the front lines as humanly possible. In the end, the front lines came to the javelins, so that didn't work out quite as expected. But it wasn't the intention of the Trump administration to really strengthen Ukraine. It was the intention of the Trump administration to cut some deals. Biden administration comes in, they're more pro-Ukraine, at least in ideology. They are not more pro-Ukraine in terms of thinking about commitments. They wanted guardrails with Russia. Instead of getting guardrails with Russia, they got a full-scale Russian invasion of Ukraine. And here it's kind of interesting because the United States, at some level, as Stefan said, the expectation was that 3 days, 3 weeks, 4 months, depending on your assessment, Russia is going to win this war relatively quickly, might face a very unpleasant occupation experience, but generally speaking, what needs to happen is that NATO needs to circle its wagons, defend the countries it does have commitments to, which is the existing members, and manage a deterrence-based relationship with Russia going forward. The United States provides intelligence to Ukraine, telling them that the Russians are going to invade, tries to provide that same intelligence to other friends and allies, feels very frustrated people aren't paying attention. Some are, some aren't, but in the event the Russians invade, and a funny thing happens, which is it turns out, as Stefan said, that the Russian military isn't as strong as everybody thought, but most especially including the Russians, which is why we all thought they were strong, was because they thought they were strong. And the Ukrainians are fighting back and doing so successfully. This opens a new avenue of approach. You're still looking forward to a deterrence-based future in Europe, but now you've got this option that you can make Russia a whole lot weaker. Maybe you can defeat it outright. Maybe it will become incapable of further aggression. But in any case, it'll have a much harder time at it. So let's use this war to get there. Is that the stated policy? Actually, sometimes we got a few officials saying that on the record. It's not usually the narrative, right? The narrative is Ukraine must win. But the reality is that Russia must lose. Russia must be weakened. The future of Europe that the Americans want is one where Russia does not make further messes. A great way to get there is for Ukraine to win. There's other ways to get there. We're okay with it, right? So I think that's kind of at the core of the policy. The other thing at the core of this policy is that this is a European problem. The United States has security commitments to Europe. Most American presidents, with the exception of Donald Trump, think that alliance commitments mean something. So the US is stuck with that. But US presidents since George W. Bush have come into office wanting to limit US commitments abroad generally. And if they want to look somewhere, it's Asia. So you've got this problem for the Americans is that each American president comes in saying, I want to do less, and I really want to do less in Europe and the Middle East. And the Middle East and Europe keep flummoxing this by demanding more attention. And so, so the United States president after president wants to do less, ends up doing more. I think Biden was a little more willing to do more than his predecessors. If Trump comes back, or honestly, if Harris wins, I think we're going to go back to that pattern of trying to do less and trying to manage the foreign policy, all with an eye towards China. And this is particularly complicated because when it comes to European security and the war in Ukraine, but not only the war in Ukraine, from Russia's perspective, this is all about America. It's about this American-led West that is on a mission to undermine Russia. The Russians think they're fighting two wars, right? One against Ukraine and the other against the West. And that West is the US-led West. When they say the West, they mean America. And the Americans are kind of going, oh, right, but China, I want to look at China. So you have this disconnect between how the Russians view what they're doing here and the demand on the Americans. There's also a disconnect between the Europeans. Stefan laid out this world in which the Europeans have realized there are security threats to them. Different views of what that means, different views of how existential that is, different views of what existential means. I would argue that one form of the existential nature of the threat, that it destroys the vision of Europe that existed and of the EU, hey, that's no longer in existence. That's over, right? Stefan says it must change. I would say it has changed. So this vision of the Europe that was, that's gone. So that war already killed it. The vision of the Europe that will be, still evolving. And here again, the United States has a problem. On the one hand, it wants European autonomy. On the other hand, it wants the Europeans to buy American weapons. And it wants to have a voice. And that's, this is a tension in American politics. There are people who disagree. So, if anything, I think what I'm presenting is set out a very clear view from the Ukrainian perspective. Stefan set out a disputed but reasonably clear view from the European perspective. From the US perspective, on the one hand, we're in a leadership role. We have to manage all of these things. We have to keep getting involved. On the other hand, this really isn't, we don't want this to be our priority. We want to have other priorities, but it ends up dragging our attention in. We're in a fight with a country that wants to have a fight with us, but that we don't particularly want to fight. I want to just quickly close by talking about some of the ways in which we think this might go forward from here. As I said, the strategy was weaken Russia as much as possible. The strategy for the last year and a half has been, 2 years, has been that, wait for the Russians to break and ask for negotiations. That isn't happening. That doesn't mean they don't necessarily want negotiations. It certainly means the message they want to send is that you, Ukraine, and its Western backers are negotiating from a position of weakness, therefore you need to offer us concessions. There are weaknesses in the Russian system. I think you could read this in a number of ways. Stefan talked about putting Ukraine in a position where it's negotiating from strength. I actually think the Ukraine and its backers need to get together and negotiate from a position of strength together, because I don't think the battlefield is where Ukraine is going to get its leverage. I think its partners are where Ukraine is going to get its leverage, and not because they're going to provide it with the magic weapon. We've provided a whole lot of magic weapons. None of them have proven magic. You can say not enough. You can say, but this is where we can debate that, but this is where we are. What leverage do the Western countries backing Ukraine have over Russia? Well, look at what makes the Russians nervous. Talk of NATO membership makes the Russians nervous. Longer range weapons for Ukraine make the Russians nervous. So instead of public fights about these things between Ukraine and the folks backing it, who are not its allies, right? They have no commitment to Ukraine. They're just the folks backing it. Maybe get together, develop a plan, and use that sort of thing as leverage with the Russians. I would also say one thing Ukrainians can do. The Russians keep saying that they're willing to negotiate as soon as Ukraine accepts the new realities. What are the new realities? The new realities are that Russia claims a whole bunch of territory in Ukraine which it does not even control on the battlefield. So Russia is asking for negotiations with the preconditions that Ukraine pre-surrender. Ukraine should not accept that. Ukraine can, however, say that it is willing to talk to the Russians as long as there are no preconditions. The Russians probably won't come to the table on that line alone, but it does put the Ukraine in a more positive position. And my final thought, just because no one has said it yet, if we do get to an endgame, it's not about territory. It's about deterring Russia into the future in Ukraine and elsewhere. That is not about the land. It is about whether Ukraine is adequately armed and able to defend itself. NATO membership is one path to it. I don't know if that's a feasible path, simply because I'm looking at our future elections and I'm looking at the US Senate, and I don't see how that happens. Though I think it's still enough to make the Russians nervous, so let's use that. I think what freaked out the Russians in 2022, it was the Ukrainian resistance. Capable Ukrainians are scary to Russia. That is, kind of worst case scenario for me is Ukraine gets some vague plan for NATO membership, but agrees to strict limits on its military and the military support it can get from partners. That's the worst of all possible outcomes. I'll close with that.
Thank you very much, Olga, for the intensive details. You raise a question, what if Trump wins or Kamala wins? And this takes us to the upcoming new election, presidential elections. And I don't know if there's going to be a huge change. So my question to you, Professor Paul, should we expect any changes from U.S. foreign policy towards Ukraine in the upcoming U.S. election?
Excellent. Thank you, Dr. Maryam. I want to start off by saying that this is the kind of serious, international, engaged conversation that you can only have in Qatar. If you look around the room, if you look at the panel, the range of discussions that we can have here, we can only have in this country where people are actually free to discuss these things from all perspectives. So it's wonderful to be here. I want to talk today about what is possible, not what I want, not what I would prefer to happen, but what I think is possible. About 6 or 7 years ago, I published an article that argued that going forward, U.S. ground strategy would be determined by the contest between two political parties that were arriving at radically different views of American identity and American grand strategy. And I defined this in the article as being a process that would ultimately resemble a coin flip. I didn't know that several years later we would be looking at quite possibly a literal coin flip election between one president who generally believes in alliances, generally believes in American commitments, generally believes in U.S. leadership, and another president, former president, who has stridently rejected these sorts of issues, who views all relationships as transactional, and who in fact seems to have kind of a gut sense that respects authoritarian leadership and authoritarian strength. I want to say that it is easy to caricature this as simply saying that a vote for Harris is a vote for U.S. policy in Ukraine, or for that matter, U.S. policy toward Israel, and that a vote for Trump is a vote to reject current U.S. policy in Ukraine and U.S. policy toward Israel. I do think that Donald Trump is somewhat unsophisticated in his thinking about foreign policy, but he is also surprising. I think that the metaphor of him throwing wrenches in policy in all directions at once is exactly right, because although I think the trend of his leadership is to reject and weaken U.S. leadership, to pull back U.S. commitments, it's also clear that from time to time he will advance particular commitments. The new book by Bob Woodward called War, which is full of dishy details on all sorts of things that have happened. You shouldn't take this as your only guide to the last 2 years of policy, but it is a revealing guide. One thing that reviews have not really taken in is that there's a number of very frank, on-the-record conversations taken from presumably Secretary Blinken's point of view with leaders in this region about how they view U.S. commitments. So it's actually worth reading for that. But one of the things that is worth reading for is a sense about how U.S. politics have conditioned U.S. leadership, and in particular, how much of this of U.S. Aid and conditions on aid to Ukraine have been driven by Joe Biden. It's interesting to remember that Joe Biden has been a figure in Washington for, well, longer than even most folks in this room have been alive. He arrived in Washington in January 1973 as a newly elected senator. Weird to recall that Joe Biden was once the voice of a young generation, but it's absolutely true. His early experiences involved being a Cold Warrior, being somebody who sought to restrain and weaken Soviet power. But he also lived through the 1990s, the changes in Ukrainian and Russian relations. It's interesting that you mention the nuclear threat reduction program. My first job in politics was as an intern for Senator Richard Lugar, whose baby that was. We had an office full of Tupolev bombers that had been disassembled. And this has, of course, changed. When Joe Biden was vice president, he argued for U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan and lethal aid to Ukraine after the 2014 invasion. Apparently, President Putin, observing the 2021 U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan, read this as a belief that Joe Biden was not committed to traditional U.S. allies. It is more likely that, in fact, Joe Biden is very focused on a sense of honor, a sense of alliances, and a sense of what works and what doesn't. The U.S. commitment to Afghanistan clearly had not worked, and there was no path forward to victory. On the other hand, Ukraine, a country that Joe Biden knows extremely well, a country that has been at the center of American politics now for 7 years. I did not know that it was possible for American politics to be so deeply entwined with Ukraine, but 2 impeachments later, 2 presidential elections coming up on a third, everything involving Hunter Biden is actually a Ukraine story. This is at the center. So Joe Biden knows the players, knows what's going on, has a good sense, has taken the measure of now 3 different Ukrainian presidents, and also knows President Putin knows what's going on. I think Olga is exactly right that the United States has made commitments to Ukraine, but is not in an alliance to Ukraine. And I don't think that there's a majority on Capitol Hill to proceed to full alliance. Even dangling this prospect, I think, raises dangerous things. I think that on the Ukrainian side, as far as I can tell, there's some magical thinking about what NATO alliance membership means. It won't come during the war, and in itself, unless there is battlefield victory or something close enough to it, it won't be a deterrent. And that's before we try to get this through Congress. So the Biden-Harris administration has been stalwart in its defense of Ukraine and its provision of limited aid, but has constantly sought to reassert that the primary American objective is not to weaken or defeat Russia, but to keep the conflict contained. This is why we have learned, among several things, first, that nuclear deterrence works. Even the prospect of a nuclear confrontation in autumn of 2022 was enough to raise American alarms to the point that it affected American policy toward Ukraine and American policy toward Russia. One of the things that happened, I think that we've actually had some very sophisticated conversations about battlefield performance, this gave the Russians time to adapt to what was happening on the battlefield, to negate the advantage of Western weaponry, to make American and European wonder weapons much less effective, and thereby blunt any prospects for a successful Ukrainian offensive in 2023. Russians misplayed the initial invasion, but have since proven adept at keeping the temperature just high enough to limit American intervention. That's why F-16s are arriving only now. That's why there continue to be limitations on HIMARS. That's why HIMARS were not delivered in the first tranches. Javelins are great, but these are personnel weapons. I mean, you or I could learn how to use them in a weekend. They cost a few $1,000s. We wouldn't last long, but we could learn how to use them. But we're talking about things that are successful major elements of deterrence which have not been provided. The other thing we've learned is that the United States and Europe are not ready for a protracted conflict. It's amazing to hear that the United States and Europe are tired of war. There's no kinetic actions happening in the West, a couple of fires in Germany, some political violence in Czechoslovakia, but what do we have to be tired of? Well, it's the prospect of yet another continuing engagement with, and this is crucial, no hope for success, and no clear understanding of what victory looks like. This is at the core, I think, of why the Trump-Vance administration would be able to mobilize a coalition to reduce American commitment. When we talk about what the West could do, when we talk about the commitments of Europe, it is important to remember that everybody in the United States has, for decades, urged the Europeans to take a different grand strategy, urged the Europeans to rearm, urged the Europeans to be ready for a war. Well, it turns out that the United States on its own does not produce enough ammunition, does not produce enough sustainment to keep troops in the field. And so it looks very clearly as if the United States, without great political will, which a Trump-Vance administration, I keep mentioning Vice President to be J.D. Vance because he is forthrightly opposed to any further aid, and given Trump's health, stands a good chance of becoming president himself in the next several years. This is just something where the politics of the alliances, the politics of U.S. domestic politics don't net out all that well for Ukraine, which means that if we're talking about new visions for the United States, new visions for the West, it is possible, and here I go back to my original point, which is that these things are beginning to turn on coin flips. They are beginning to turn on very thin margins. It is possible that, I will say, it is certain that we will have a new vision of the West. I do not think that conflict will necessarily lead to a new vision of the West that we will be comfortable with. My last point is that US politics have refracted the Ukrainian-Russian confrontation through a very traditional Cold War lens. The metaphors that people reached for in January 2022 were of Afghanistan, were of Vietnam, or of a protracted occupation or resistance. But this neglected the fact that this is no longer the 20th century. There are no longer just two superpowers who count. Russia wouldn't even count among them if we were ranking superpowers. And so much of the diplomatic and other action that has taken place has involved the Global South on commodities trades, at the UN General Assembly, in terms of international public opinion. The United States and, to a lesser degree, because they have more skin in the game, Ukraine have not proven adept at reaching out to global Southern audiences, have not proven adept at driving wedges in BRICS, have not proven adept at managing the sorts of very fine-grained sanctions that are required to have a difference on the battlefield. And this is something where you can actually, I think, quite clearly see the strengths and limits of Joe Biden's personal abilities, which is everything that he has done well are things that he would have done well in 1975, and the things that he has done poorly on are things that were not factors in 1975. So I think that what we'll see in the next several years will be, if Trump wins, wild oscillations. I don't believe that the war will end on day one. I think that Ukraine and especially Eastern and Northern European partners have a great deal of resources, but I do think that things could be quite more complicated. But even if Harris wins, this is not a question of redemption for Ukraine, because I think that the costs of intervention, the terms of intervention, without progress, you will begin to continue to see public support ebbing for continued US intervention.
Sir Paul, we've heard different perspectives from Ukraine, from Europe, from United States, and what about Russia, Professor Andrei? I mean, what Russia looks like after 3 years of war?
Okay, first of all, thank you very much for the invitation. For me, it's a really very important event in terms of opportunity. Yeah? Yeah? Where?
It's
okay, so? Okay, fine. So, first of all, thank you very much for the invitation, because this event is really important for me for better understanding of attitudes of different sides. Yeah. Regarding your question, very shortly, situation in Russia in terms of economic situation and political situation after 3 years of war formally looks pretty good. In terms of economic indicators, it was 3.6% economic growth in last year. There are expectations about 4% economic growth for this year. In terms of incomes, it was increase at 8% in terms of real increase of salaries, wages for last year. In this year, for first 6 months, it was about a 10% increase in real wages. If we will talk about political dimension, again, Kremlin could suppress successfully all anti-war protests already in 2022. In the March of this year, we could see with presidential elections with 88% of votes for Putin. According to public opinion surveys, majority of Russian citizens are supporting this special military operation and so on. But I would say that reality is much more complex. And for instance, if we will talk about economic dimension, first of all, we can see quite serious structural distortions, because practically all money allocated to the economy on the side of government were moved firstly for the interest of army and military-industrial complex. And on one hand, we can see increasing demand in the economy, it's true. Yeah? Also due to higher salaries in the economy on one hand, also, for instance, due to these huge monetary installments, payments for men contracted to the army, mobilized to the army, and so on. But on the other hand, economy simply didn't have resources, both in terms of production capacity and labor, yeah, to respond on this demand. And it created a situation of growing inflation. No, for better understanding, just yesterday, Russian Central Bank increased key rate to the level of 21%. And in July of last year, so 1 year ago actually, it was at the level of 7.5%. But maybe a more important issue is about military expenses. Just 1 month ago, Russian government, Ministry of Finance, announced a draft of new budget for 2025 and the next 2 years. And we can see a huge difference not only in numbers but also in expectations. Because, for instance, 1 year ago, the same Ministry of Finance also announced a significant increase in military expenses. It was plus 70% for this year, for 2024. But at the same time, 1 year ago, government planned to decline military expenses significantly in 2025. So initial plans 1 year ago for 2025 was about 8.5 trillion rubles for the army. Now it is about 13.5 trillion rubles, and without any decline after that. Because before it was mostly about some kind of concentration of resources for next year, and after that we will come back to some kind of normality, normal situation, and so on. Now it is not so. And we can see also, and for better understanding, this difference, 5 trillion rubles, yeah, it is about $50 billion. So it is a really significant amount of money in any case. To cover these expenses, government increased already quite significantly taxes, both personal income tax, profit tax, and so on. But even more, first time for all rule of Mr. Putin, we can see a significant decline in the amount of money allocated to social policy. For this year, it was 7.7 trillion rubles. For next year, it will be 6.5 trillion rubles. So it's a really significant decline. In terms of some kind of another indicators, for instance, State Duma, Russian parliament, officially announced discussion, I think maybe some weeks ago, about extension of operation for 140,000 of elevators in apartment buildings, simply because government don't have money to replace these old elevators. So it is already about some kind of a real risk for security of ordinary people. Why I'm talking about all these things? The specificity of last 3 years, including this year, was in the availability of a really huge amount of money for Kremlin. In my view, unfortunately, also due to contradictory design of international sanctions. But nevertheless, Kremlin and personally Mr. Putin, during these 3 years, had enough money to finance the war, to cover all social obligations, and even to support economy. Now the situation started to change. And actually, people in Kremlin recognize it quite clearly. Yeah? And they started some kind of preparations. In my view, already from last year, especially from the end of last year. And one of additional reasons for it was related to Prigozhin's immunity in June of last year. No, for better understanding, Prigozhin was the head of Wagner private military group. participated very actively in this war, starting from the autumn of 2022. And before, he participated in many operations in Africa, also here in Syria, in Libya, and so on. And he could capture in one day, in June of 2023, Rostov-on-Don, and announced march to Moscow. After that, it was some kind of negotiations between Kremlin and Prigozhin, and Kremlin could manage the problem. 2 months later, Prigozhin was killed. But this event was really very important in terms of understanding that in the case of real crisis, and it was real crisis, practically nobody on the side of Russian elites was not ready to defend Putin. And it was, in my view, very important signal for Kremlin. And they started to change the model because before, about 2 years, they tried to create the attitude of normality. The main idea was that it is not a war, it is only a special military operation. We will manage it, and you can run your business, enjoy your life, and so on and so on, go to parks. And it was even, especially in 2022, quite significant governmental investments in different kind of public infrastructure, including creation of new parks in many cities, not only in Moscow. Starting from the end of last year, in my view, Kremlin changed the policy. And now it is about mobilization of economy and society with some kind of new requirements for elites, for ordinary people. But key problem is that during 2 previous decades, Putin personally and Kremlin used totally another approach. Because, yes, it was about some kind of delegation of authority to make any political decisions to the Kremlin, it's true, yeah. But in exchange, Kremlin created conditions for improvement of living standards and for personal consumptions. And yes, contrary to political activity, it was not any real restrictions for personal freedom and liberties. Just now, especially during last year, we can see significant changes in this field. And the question is, will be such kind of changes acceptable not only for elites, but also for ordinary people? In terms of some kind of real steps, I see some indicators of replacement of elite. On one hand, it is about nationalization of assets in the case of business. Yeah? It is maybe more mixed story, and I can provide some kind of additional comments if it will be necessary. But even more important story is about a replacement of top-level people in the bureaucracy. In February of this year, Putin personally announced a new Qatar reserve program called Time of Heroes. This program was fully composed by participants of this special military operation. And some of these people were appointed already during last weeks to high-level positions in bureaucracy. Coming to some kind of final points. Contrary to this attitude of stability, in my view, Putin regime just now is really vulnerable, and it will be during next 3 or 4 years, because just now regime is in transition to new model. But if this transition with replacement of elites on one hand, and with much stronger restrictions for any ordinary people, if such kind of transition will be successful, unfortunately we can see a much more dangerous picture, because in my view, Kremlin now is moving to something like North Korea, but it will be North Korea of Russian size with Russian military potential. So.
Thank you very much, Andrea. It's very interesting to hear your point of view regarding the situation in Russia. Thank you very much for our panelists, and now we'll open up the door for questions. I know there's plenty of questions, so please introduce yourself and then make your questions or comments very briefly. So, Bismillah. Okay. Let's start with the lady over there. She raised her hand first.
Thank you. Is it working? Okay. Thank you so much. My name is June Park. I'm a South Korean political economist and currently serving as visiting fellow at the Emmy Council here in Doha. Thank you very much for the various views on Russia and the Ukraine. I'd like to pose a question regarding the panelists' assessment on North Korea's participation in the war, because it is anticipated from my own country's National Intelligence Service that from tomorrow the North Koreans will be on the front lines. For this, I'd like to pick the brains of the panelists on how this will unfold, whether you see this as a path toward escalation for more seeking from the US side for South Korea to take part in terms of ammunition provision. Any kind of thought on this matter would be very much appreciated. Thank you.
Take one more question or, okay. Gentleman over there.
Okay, thank you very much. My name is Dr. Khalil Said. I'm the director of Nature Conservation Center here in Qatar. So my question to Stefan, you didn't talk about a very important appearing player, that BRICS. So is it just a demonstration that Russia is not insulated, or it's a real economic and political threat to the West? And to Olga, nothing can make Russians that nervous rather than giving Ukraine tactic nuclear weapon, I think. Yeah. What's a good man? Yeah, what do you think of this? Because Budapest agreement is not more pursued by Russia or somebody else. And to Mr. Paul, yes, Mr. Yes, Professor Paul. It's good. Okay, is it a political strategy of United States towards Ukraine or Europe an issue of a person or administration, or it's a strategic line? So would be let's say a radical change of the strategy if a new administration comes?
Thank you. One more question, and then we'll do round two. The gentleman over there, Yusuf, right? Okay.
Khalid Al-Yusuf from Georgetown University, but I'm asking just on behalf of my personal interest. I do not represent my school, at least in this question. So I have interest in both countries, actually. I do have business in Ukraine and in Russia. I do feel, however, that the panel is a bit more skewed toward Ukraine, a little bit more toward NATO, so I'm going to ask the question, actually, more from the NATO perspective side. So NATO, since the 1990s, what Western allies have failed to explain is the major security threat for Russia, which is the expansion of NATO from the 1990s, when I believe it was Mikhail Gorbachev who broke out the Soviet Union. There were guarantees from Western allies that there will be no NATO expansion eastward. At that time, it was 13 states. Now you are standing at 31 states. And I guess one of the biggest issues for Russia was Ukraine need to remain neutral. And honestly, when I was in Ukraine about 20 years ago, nobody wanted to join NATO. People were very neutral. But I believe a lot of Western pressure is coming on Ukraine to join NATO. So that's, I guess, one part of the question. And again, we could ask maybe James Baker. I think he would have more information about that.
Yeah.
Okay.
So shall we start with the first questions about South Korea?
If I may permit, because I think it's good. It's on. Okay, so I think nothing makes Ukraine more pro-NATO than Russia, actually. And I think this is what we've seen increasingly, not just with Ukraine, but with Finland, with Sweden, countries who decided to join NATO. If you ask yourself the question why, country like Finland decided to join NATO, it's simply because Kremlin sent this ultimatum actually in December of 2021 that will restrict, that basically is here to decide for other countries their security. And it was the red flag for those countries that who is Russia here to decide how you organize your own security. So as a Ukrainian, I would say, you know, Ukraine has earned the right to be in NATO and Russia has lost the right to say anything about it. And actually here I disagree with Olga, because I do not think that NATO, Ukraine's security arrangement should be up for any negotiation with Russia. It's not up to Russia to say how a country like Ukraine can feel secure. It's up to us discussing with Germany, with Poland, with those who feel the same level of threat and exposure. And the moment we take it off on negotiating table, Putin will understand that he has to come back to Russia's internationally recognized borders. This is what it is about. Russia is illegally annexing territory of its neighbors and then forcing them to actually accept it, and forcing all of us to accept his interpretation of the world. So on North Korean troops, I think it's a serious escalation, because it's actually involving third-party military personnel in the war. And I think that it's very dangerous for South Korea, first of all, because these troops are here to learn from North Korea how to fight against American equipment. And we see, especially before this deployment, a serious escalation bilaterally, where they exploded bridges and rhetoric and taking down monuments to reconciliation. And that is done on purpose. And I think there could be a certain coordination of this axis of Iran, Russia, and North Korea about further destabilizing the world, creating contingency for America, for whoever is the new president in the White House, where there are security guarantees in the region to South Korea, how they will react to. So they are poking United States in every geographic area possible, and Russia is happy to enable this. And I think that's why I hope South Korea will revise its approach to providing lethal military assistance to Ukraine directly, because right now, this is a direct threat to South Korea.
Yeah, it's working? Okay, very good. Just two sentences also on this escalation with North Korea. I think it is a mutual benefit in a way. I think North Korea will also learn on this war more also in terms of training, Russian support. It's the same with the ammunition which is produced in North Korea. Russia improved the quality of the ammunition in North Korea. That has an impact on the situation in the region itself, in Asia, and also in the relations with South Korea. So I think this is not just that Russia needs resources from others, it's outsourcing what it cannot produce by itself, but it has an impact on the security situation in Asia. And I think this is a very dangerous development. We can see here, and also from a European perspective, this is really unacceptable, because Russia is really dragging other countries into a war in Europe. And I think it has several implications, which needs to have consequences also. On BRICS. I'm somehow a bit skeptical about the whole BRICS. I think on one hand, yes, I think there is something emerging. We understand this is getting a much more multipolar world, much more transactional world, and there are these clubs of countries who are non-West, let's say it like this, and I think the main Russian idea is to use BRICS to develop an alternative financial system, alternative banking system, currency system. I'm just skeptical if the countries in BRICS really have the interest to be on the side of Russia. against the West or against whomever, yeah? I think they want to benefit from both sides. They want to benefit from relations with Russia and benefit from the relations with Europe and the US. So they have economic, they don't want to be in a bloc against someone. What is the main Russian idea of BRICS? So, and that's why I don't think it will work. I would even say for a country like Turkey, it's more about bargaining with Europe and the US than about being part of BRICS itself. So I'm rather, so let's say, I don't say it does not have an effect. Sure, it has an effect. Also, if these leaders meet in Kazan, it is a statement. It is a statement. You are with Russia in a way, with Russian leader who are actually in a war in Europe, and for Putin it's a statement, I'm not isolated. Yeah, so for others it's a statement, we can also make deals with Russia, yeah. And, while it has so I think it shows the limits also of the US and of Western power. But I don't think this will lead to a consolidated institution which is purely anti-Western or anti-whatever, yeah. I'm very, very skeptical here. And maybe just one sentence on this NATO expansion. I think it's also a kind of Russian disinformation or Russian myth to say that there was an agreement that there will be no NATO expansion in Europe. I think we have historians who are working on the documents and on the people who participated in this process, and there was never any written guarantee that there would be no NATO expansion. What we can say is I think the US felt so strong at this time and saw a very weak Russia that it made maybe some decisions also which would it have not done before. Yeah. So in terms of creating this opportunity for NATO enlargement, but I think this is another wrong Russian disinformation or myth that NATO or the US enforced others to join NATO. You have to apply to join NATO. You have to ask NATO if you can join. You are not getting under pressure to do so. I think there were many countries like Georgia, like Ukraine before who wanted to join NATO because of Russia, but the member states didn't allow it. France and Germany blocked this because of Russia. Yeah. So I think it's just a wrong paradigm how NATO functions. Yeah. So you have to apply for. You are not forced to. You have to bring more security to NATO when you want to join, and not less security. That's why NATO members are so skeptical at the moment that Ukraine is joining, because Ukraine is in a war. So that would create more trouble for NATO. That's why we also, as Germany, are maybe not so much interested at the moment that Ukraine will join. But after the war, when Ukraine has a very strong army, it might make sense for NATO if Ukraine applies for NATO membership. So I think I would say there's a different logic, at least from my perspective. And I think that's very much driven also by Russia to say NATO and the US wants to weaken us. I'm here rather skeptical about this narrative.
Thank you. Maybe Andrei, you want to add something?
Yeah,
Okay.
I would respond on the last question. In my view, it's really quite important. Yeah. For better understanding, I'm a Russian citizen. Yeah. And I understand the position of Ukrainian colleagues, but perhaps, especially for our audience, some response on the Russian side would be important. I know well these arguments, and they are really quite popular also in Russia now. But I would remember that even 20 years ago, Mr. Putin was really quite open, both to European Union, to cooperation with NATO, and so on. And more broadly, yes, NATO is not perfect organization. It's true. Yeah? No, and even in terms of response just now, we can see all internal contradictions and so on. But we are talking about some kind of global order, nevertheless, with interests of different actors on different sides, and it's normal, and about competition between different sectors. And from this point of view, for instance, in my view, it's quite important to compare China and Russia. China, starting 40 years ago from much worse positions, yeah, could create competitive economic model. And Russia, yes, Russia started this process later, but especially in 2000s, exactly under the rule of Mr. Putin, Russia had huge financial resources for development. And these opportunities were not realized. simply because Mr. Putin, with his elite, were not ready to real some kind of self-constraints. And therefore, for instance, if you will consider a position of China and position of Russia, okay, it is BRICS Forum in Kazan and so on, but in my view, again, it is mostly about demonstration. There is really very few things for a real economic model, a real alternative, and so on. But China has some kind of alternative to the West. And therefore, it can talk with US, with Europe from totally another positions. And in the case of Russia, yes, Mr. Putin inherited Soviet military potential. And because it's really so, he failed in economic competition already in 2000s, already starting from 2011, 2012, facing these mass political protests in Moscow after this electoral fraud in parliamentary elections 2011. He moved to totally another rhetoric, starting to talk about West as enemy for Russia during decades and centuries, actually, not decades, yeah, with some kind of focus on self-isolation of Russia and so on. In my view, it was done mostly for the purposes of domestic politics, because he needed to mobilize support for himself. And again, I'm not a supporter, for instance, in some cases of activity of NATO, and we know many of stories. Yeah, what if is imperfect, but such kind of arguments, in my view, it's really about some kind of manipulation, oriented mostly, first of all, to a Russian audience, and also, in some sense, to some international audience, but not based on reality. It is not only about these historical facts regarding concrete documents in 1990 or in 1991, but it's about overall logic.
Yeah. Thank you, Olga.
This on? Okay. So I think North Korea, it's a really interesting development. And you can read it in so many different ways all at once, right? Is it a sign of Russian escalation? Is it a sign of Russian weakness? Is it a threat to South Korea? Or does it actually reduce the threat to South Korea if a whole bunch of North Korean weapons and soldiers get eliminated on the battlefields of Ukraine? Or maybe some of them surrender and provide lots of interesting information to interrogators. The speculation that I've heard is that the Russians and North Koreans would be crazy to put them on the battlefield precisely because of the defection risk. And so then the speculation was that they were going to be used to guard the Russian borders, which is, seriously, you're going to have foreign military personnel guarding your borders. That's unusual. So it's really unclear. I'm going to add one more question that was somebody brought up to me that I hadn't thought of before, is the implications for the UN sanctions on North Korea, if they're aligned with Russia, do those then transfer over to Russia if it's engaged in such advanced military cooperation with North Korea? Because whereas the sanctions on Russia that were imposed after the full-scale invasion, there's been various thinking from various countries on whether they need to comply with them, the North Korea sanctions are pretty universally accepted. So what does that mean if these, if this is Russia's brand new ally? Tactical nuclear weapons for Ukraine. I mean, the short answer is no, right? Absolutely not. The slightly longer answer, look, it would be a violation of so many of the agreements and commitments the United States has made, which the US actually does care about, that would rule it out. It is logistically a nightmare. That would rule it out. Strategically, it gives you absolutely nothing. There is no real rationale for nuclear use in this war. And so I think if you wanted to threaten the Russians with it, the Russians know all of that. So it is not a credible threat. The Russians are super freaked out about NATO enlargement, despite all of the difficulties and challenges that I think Stefan laid out. So that's a useful thing to put in play, even if it does prove never to come into being, because the Russians are so freaked out. That the United States would give the Russians tactical nuclear weapons might be a rumor that gets floated, but nobody in serious Russian decision-making circles would take it seriously. I think the NATO thing has been well covered by my colleagues. I will say this about Russian security concerns in Europe, though. Just because I judge Russian security concerns to not be valid does not mean the Russians don't actually think this. So there is a logic to thinking about what you can do, not so much to reassure Russia, because what I have found both over my experience over the last 3 decades and my reading of history is that the Russians are impossible to effectively reassure, but to develop a system where they're not, where they feel that they've got a deal, where they've constrained their adversaries and in exchange are constrained themselves. I think that is a conversation you can have. I don't think that's a conversation about limiting Ukraine's capacity to defend itself. I think that's a conversation about deployments and activities in various theaters. I think that's a conversation that the United States and other NATO members were willing to have in late 2021, and the Russians rejected a serious conversation. They basically said, if you just go back to your military posture of the mid-1990s, we'll talk, which of course leaves lots of states undefended, so bad plan. But I think that's a kind of the broader conversation of these are the weapon systems, these are the activities you worry about, these are the weapon systems, these are the activities we worry about. That's a very reasonable conversation to have.
Thank you. Professor Paul?
Yeah, so I agree. I think the NATO discussion has been had, so I'll talk about some of the other ones. With the North Korean assistance, and you get different numbers from different countries' security services about what they're willing to talk about. For me, what this suggests is that we are beginning to see something that looks, I think people have referred from time to time as Ukraine as the Spanish Civil War of the 21st century, as a kind of great power testing ground. I think that what we're beginning to see is something that is much more internationalized, something that instead resembles the Chinese War of the Chinese-Japanese War of the 1930s, in which a number of direct competitors are matched by international partners, and they're using this for different reasons. So, what does Kim Jong-un want out of transferring troops? Does he want straight up money? Does he want access to oil? Does he want international solidarity to be broken? Does he want technology transfer for ballistic missiles, which is, I think, what the current American interpretation is, which the Russians might also be happy to supply, because anything that makes a North Korean deterrent now turns to their advantage in terms of making the international system worse. This resembles to me much more, say, German or American intervention and provision of weapons to competitors in the 1930s in China, where everybody was interested in perhaps learning battlefield techniques, learning about strategies, keeping their hands in, preventing things from coming to an end. What South Korea does will be up to South Korea. Of course, South Korea has tried to stay directly out of the war, although South Korean Polish military assistance has certainly grown quite a bit over the past few years. The question about grand strategy and the United States. If Trump wins, things will change. That might be a change in what we call the second moment in terms of the variation of what we could see. I can't give you a good direction that says that Trump will absolutely just be Putin's best friend and everything will be one. We had 4 years and it didn't quite happen, although things were like, they got javelins, they got assistance, and also he tried to use leverage over President Zelensky to get Joe Biden out of the race. Lots of stuff. What is more important in this conversation, bizarrely, is actually Congress. There's also congressional elections. You may have heard the United States has 3 branches of government. This is the first one. If you have a Senate that is 52-48, you can still assemble a floor majority for support to Ukraine. If it's 53-47, that's more remote. If the House goes Democratic, you'll have a much easier chance getting support for Ukraine. The biggest problem in 2023 for Ukraine was simply that the U.S. refused to give assistance. Imagine $80 billion in assistance coming when Ukraine needed it most. 6 months is a long time on a dynamic battlefield where the Russians are learning and adapting. Ukraine has been incredibly entrepreneurial in military tactics and technology, but once Russia finds something that works, since the Second World War, the Russian Soviet military system has been great at forcing adaptation down to the unit level, which they have managed to do, not least because in many cases it looks like their unit tactics now resemble Wagner. Yuri Prigozhin, don't rest in peace, was a tactical innovator, and now those tactics are being applied. So 6 months here, 6 months there may be a crisis in 3 or 4 years. The difference between my pessimism and Andrei's pessimism about different countries is simply that I think that we might come to a decision point before 3 or 4 years down the line. So if Harris wins and she faces a divided Congress, you'll see a reprise of the past 2 years. Harris will have to take domestically increasingly unpopular steps to maintain the U.S. alliance system. The pressure on the European allies will be intense. Most NATO applications are voluntary, but after February 2022, Joe Biden did call the heads of government of Finland and Sweden and say, maybe it's time to abandon this neutrality stuff, which was certainly less of an application and more of a gilded invitation. Although even there, Hungary and Turkey were able to extract. This is what the American.
So we're running out of time.
The Bob Woodward book. The Bob Woodward book is very clear that the American administration is quite willing, at least, to take credit for this.
Okay.
And the Finns will also always be willing to say it wasn't their
Exciting
being pressured.
conversation. So.
I mean, yeah.
Next time, right? Yeah. We'll see.
Anyway,
because we're running out of time. To be fair, we'll go to this section. Any questions from there?
I think
No?
Finn and Sweden.
Okay.
As a package. But this is like.
Thank you so much for this fantastic discussion, and thank you, Qatar, for hosting this event. My name is Andrei Kuzmenko. I'm ambassador of Ukraine to this beautiful country. And indeed, I was 7 months at the front line in 2015, so I know this a bit by my own experience. 19th of November will mark 1,000 days of full-scale neocolonial genocidal war against Ukraine. Next March, it seems to be, it will be 4,000 days. This is a time to make certain consequences, certain decisions, to make certain, how better to say, observations about this war and to learn the lessons. I have learned that the international system of law doesn't work. International system of the international organizations, it is undermined since even the UN Secretary General meeting the war criminal and shaking hands. The aggressor states still have the illegally possessed chair at the United Nations Security Council. The weak reaction made possible everything which we are facing now, and much, much difficult development compared to those which could have been if this reaction have been much more stronger. Well, we also see that this conflict has a global implication, which means even African country feels shortage of food from Ukraine. Mm-hmm. This means even the Far East region right now, in fact, in the war in Ukraine. And war right now is in the military conflict with two nuclear states. The country which disarmed itself. Quite interesting. So, if I may to ask each of the respectful panelists with very short question, what major lesson have you learned from this 1,000 day?
Question, and then I think the gentleman over there, he was raising his hand. Yeah, okay.
Thank you. Am I audible? Hello? Yeah. Thank you. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to ask this question. I'm Prasanna. I'm a lawyer, and I'm looking at it from a global geopolitical stance. Now, China, North Korea, and Iran, countries with both nuclear capabilities and staunch anti-US sentiments, are now supplying personnel and weapons to further, it's Mr. Putin's war in Ukraine. And sanctions imposed by the US are merely a don't do business with these countries notice, and they're not really a strong imposition of any real implications to do business in the world. Now, my question is to Ms. Olga and Professor Paul. In Ms. Olga's view of the US being at the helm of leadership in international affairs, and US being a permanent member of the UN Security Council, and the largest military supplier in the world with nearly 42% of military capabilities, and 42% of the world's arms trade, why has the US not pledged a firm commitment to Ukraine's security or tried to conduct a diplomatic mediation? And is this because there is a strong arms lobby in the States which is supplying which is backing or fueling or benefiting from the supply of weapons to Ukraine?
Thank you. Well, I'm really sorry, but I'm a big fan of Gerd Ninnemann, so I'll give you opportunity to ask questions if you have. Professor Gerd? Yeah. Can anyone pass the microphone?
Thanks very much. I thought better to let the audience ask more questions. But so Gerd Nonman from Georgetown University. I was going to put something in, and of course my colleague earlier, I'll have to say I'll disagree with him. I just was going to throw in a question about, a lot of the discussion has been about Russian security concerns and so on, and NATO expansion, and very much the kind of stuff that John Mearsheimer, a famous realist scholar that comes back in my classes all the time, would have made and has been making for lots of videos and performances. The problem, I think, with that is that it's kind of blind to a whole spectrum of other factors. One of the speakers, of course, has pointed to domestic Russian politics, which is at least as important as any of that. And secondly, there is the ideational question, I would suggest, and I wonder what anyone would want to contribute on that. The idea that Putin's had for a very long time about what Russia is, not about security, but what Russia is and what it should be, its empire, this imperial view. And this is not something that's come up since the Ukraine crisis. If you look back through his writings and statements over decades, really, you can see that. And that's surely, I would argue, at least as important. So in other words, I'd suggest one can't understand it by looking purely at security concerns. On that question about NATO and guarantees supposedly of not expanding, the one person who's put pay to that whole story is in fact Gorbachev himself. He has said subsequently, that's not what the promise was, and the world has changed. He was saying at the time of those discussions, there was no prospect of all of these new independent countries appearing on the scene. That was a completely different sort of world. And he has said himself, of course we couldn't expect to dictate to all those newly independent countries what they could and couldn't do. So,
anyone want to take the chance to?
Okay,
so you start with this way. Okay.
That's a good question. But just briefly, I think current Russian leadership is the biggest threat to Russian people. It's the biggest threat to Russian security. It's Putin who is putting millions of his men to death for nothing. It's legally recognized as unprovoked aggression. Ukraine in no way provoked Russia to invade. There was no reason for this. And also, just to share with you a quote from one of the defense ministers from one of the Baltic states who said, he said, you know, Russia is pregnant with self-destruction. It's not us who are doing it, it's themselves who are doing it. And until Russia starts being preoccupied how they organize affairs on this one of the biggest landmass on the globe, we will not be secure. And this is the strategy also for Ukraine, is to make sure Russia starts being busy with itself, not with Georgia, not with Moldova, and not with Ukraine. So the biggest lesson for me is in this war, you cannot win the war without a strategy. And this is why it is. Ukraine has one strategy, and the United States as its main backer, and Europe has no strategy. And until we align, and this is why I call it the crunch time, if we align the strategy and command resources, we have a chance. If not, we will be all transactional, all each for its own, and all worse off.
Also, it's working, yeah? Quick answer. I think it goes in a similar direction. Main lesson learned for me is really the need for leadership and also the political will to do things. I think what we see on the Russian side is the willingness to do things and to pay a high price for it. I don't see this will and willingness, at least in terms of really doing the things which we are talking about, on our side, and I think this is a big challenge. And maybe just a reaction to the last point. I think it's really important what Andrei said, this interlink between domestic and foreign policy in Russia, and the crisis of the Putin system in 2011 and 12 with these mass demonstrations and the need for new legitimization resources because there was no growth model, no perspective of development for the country, and that's why the US and NATO and the West was built up as the main enemy, because it also functions in this system. I think still I would say, I don't want to use this term again, but I think we thought in the beginning, we talked about this end of history, yeah? So I think we thought that Russia will become like us, and I think there was a window maybe, there was a small window maybe in the 90s somehow to do things differently. I'm not so sure. On the other hand, I think what we see now is the long legacy of Russian elites and of Russian society, which is as I said, it's imperial power, it's a colonial power, and the only mean to stay this power which is left over is the military means. There's no soft power, there's no economic perspective for this country under Putin. So it needs, in the end, it has only military means to keep the empire in a way together. But I think that's not enough, in my opinion. Yeah.
Thank you, Olga. I think there's a question for you.
All right, thank you. So major lesson, I'm going to cheat and I'm going to offer two. Because in the early stages of the war, the major lesson for me was that I should have trusted my gut on the Russian military and its capacity, because I'd spent a lot of time studying the Russian military. And then I started doing other things for a while, so I'd backed away from it. And in that period, the assessment of Russian military capabilities had gone way up. And I had doubts about that because I thought that they were listening to what the Russians said about themselves, and it's always dangerous to base your assessment solely on what the adversary says about themselves. But enough really smart people were telling me things, and I wasn't doing the work myself. I thought, okay, I guess. Should have trusted my gut. More recently, what I'm understanding is that my gut instinct, and here my gut instinct is wrong, is just how important the information space is for policymaking in the current moment. That it is, I mean, it really has shifted the debates, and the debates have shifted what policymakers do and can do and how they're constrained. And I cannot fully wrap my head around that. And I think that's kind of the challenge for me as somebody who tries to think about how to make policy better, is that I have to factor that in. Is the U.S. weapons, are the U.S. weapons manufacturers preventing mediation and diplomacy in Ukraine? No, the Russian unwillingness to come to the negotiating table is preventing mediation and negotiations in Ukraine. There is absolutely a complicated dance going on between defense industries and the US and in Europe, and the governments. Folks want long-term contracts if they're going to shift the way that they produce. Governments don't actually want to give them long-term contracts, which is a little bit odd because all evidence does suggest this is going to be an issue for a really long time. It's okay to sign a long-term contract. But governments don't like to do that for a variety of reasons. It's a very complicated equation, but I think most Europeans and Americans and their weapons companies would much prefer to manufacture for deterrence in the long term, which you can do lots of fancy and interesting things with and build lots of weapons that'll never be used, rather than produce artillery systems and shells for the near term, which are a lot less fun and a lot less lucrative. So they're not driving this. In terms of whether it's security driving Putin, ideology, look, I used to teach a class on Russian foreign policy, which I had to stop teaching because the war started taking up too much of my time. Russian security perceptions are overdetermined. I can tell you a gender story. I can tell you a history story. I can tell you an ideology story. It's all going to take me in that direction. None of it will take me to a full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Right. To get there, I need the system of government, which is a very isolated man making decisions on the basis of faulty information and bad analysis and a misjudgment of his own military. That's what gets me to a full-scale invasion of Ukraine. So I think it's really important to separate these things out.
I think that's absolutely right. And next time we do this, I need to go ahead of you because you're taking all of my points. But I think that Dr. Oliker has done this exactly right. I do teach a Russian foreign policy course, and I do teach it for curricular reasons around the theme of identity. And it's impossible to get to reconciliation. There are things that shape how the Russian public, Russian elites see the world. Russia's never going to see itself as a normal country. It's always going to see it fine. But yeah, how do we end up here? How do we end up here? Not in 2014. But in 2022 and afterward, you can't get to that story without one guy. And I will say I'm enough of a TED Hop aficionado to say people around him constructing narratives that make sense. But that's a handful, 12 people we could probably name, maybe not even a dozen. Excellency, to your point, what I have learned is that events don't speak for themselves. The way you describe this, I'm sure that the Ukraine has a very capable representative in Brasilia, but Brasilia, Johannesburg, they need to hear this story because when you look at how President Lula or President Ramaphosa describes this war, clearly it is not taking into account the one-sided nature of what happened. Everyone had the ability to watch what happened, and yet the both-sidesing, even the denial of what the structure has become, is real. This relates to Dr. Oliker's point because the information space has become extraordinarily contested, and without solid, believable, credible stories that fit every aspect of this, in a struggle in which, for the month leading up to the invasion, the consistent line was that there would be no invasion. There was 2 weeks of silence afterward, and then a new line was promulgated, and it was almost like watching the 1939 happen in real time. It was that big of a switch. The United States and the West have been very good at talking to themselves. They have not been good at talking to a global audience. This is something where Ukraine, consumed by a struggle for its survival, bears no responsibility. But as I said earlier, President Biden and his administration got many things right, but got this completely wrong. BRICS does matter. As I mentioned at the beginning, the problem has been that the United States has not been able to convince folks in Brasilia or in South Africa or in India that their long-term interests do not include a Russia that wrecks every aspect of the international order. That simple statement, as much as it seems like we're in a realist world in which interests and power determines everything, the argument around who is justified, who is the victim, who is at fault, that argument, that space matters well. And that is something where, although I think that Russian effectiveness in the first few weeks was determined by the fact that only Putin, regardless of his military advisors, would have launched that invasion in that way, what Putin is good at is, in fact, what a standard issue KGB playbook for manipulation would have been like. not just in Moldova, not just in Ukraine before 2014, but also in the United States since 2016. This has proven to be extremely successful, and it may in fact be that the margin of decision comes from arts that people in the West figured that globalization had rendered useless.
Thank you. Andrei, you want to add anything?
Thank you for this question. It's really quite important. I understand arguments of my colleagues, but maybe I will try to provide some another dimension. First of all, with all extremely huge costs of this war for Ukraine, in my view, unfortunately, this war is really part of a much bigger crisis of a global order. Yeah, and from this point of view, you are fully right. Again, in my view, this crisis, this process, started with a global financial crisis in 2008 or 2009, because it was no substantial response on this crisis. In all countries, practically all governments used money to cover some kind of social consequences, but it was no real changes in the model. And after that, we can see on one hand Arab Spring and all revolutions here, all this development in Europe, in US, with Trump and so on and so on. Okay, maybe it is a much bigger picture, but even coming back to this war, why sanctions more generally is maybe not efficient at all, but much less efficient comparing to any initial expectations. Simply because a significant part of countries representing global south or the rest in definitions of Fiona Hill and so on, didn't support it in different ways and with different reasons. And in my view, it is exactly the indicator that a new global order is needed. And it can be created only on the basis of negotiations between developed countries and developing countries. But interesting point and important point in my view is that Russia had all opportunities to take part in this process as member of G8 and so on and so on. But it was no real offer on Russian side during all these years. And finally, Putin preferred to use last argument like this aggression against Ukraine. And maybe very last point, again coming back to your question about NATO and so on and so on. 1 year ago, at one conference in DC, one expert focused on China, provided interesting comment with some kind of comparison of Russia and China, Russian elite and Chinese elite, and the interests of two countries. In his assessment, China and Chinese elite was and is main beneficiary of current global order. And therefore, there is no any interest on Chinese side to destroy this order. They would make some changes, and of course they would get some kind of broader access to decision making in this process. Of course, it is the question about the response on the Western side. And for instance, US, unfortunately, in my view, is not very ready to such kind of solutions. And it is exactly the question. But the problem, for instance, for Russia is that, according to this Chinese expert, at any global order, led by US, by China, by G20 and so on, current Russia, with current economic model, current political model, and led by Putin, will fail. And only this creation of global chaos is the way for Putin and for his elite to keep power. It's a problem. But at the same time, it's really a create actually threat not only for Russian people, but for the world. And not only for Ukraine. It's a really very serious threat for European security and more broadly.
What a heated discussion. So join me to thank our panelists for their insightful contributions. And now we'll have a break. We'll be back around 10 minutes break. Yeah.